Just going to hand over to Daniel in a moment. So I first met Daniel at the last conference, which was actually the last face-to-face conference. Was it last year or the year before now?
I can't remember. I was trying to think about that. It might have been last year.
Yeah, it might be early or mid last year. But Daniel, I'll let him introduce himself. Is one of Australia's, perhaps if not world's, well-known Kanban experts, and looking to learn a lot from Dan today in regards to how to take Kanban to the enterprise level and scaling agility as well. So I'll hand over to you, Dan. You've got the conch.
No worries. Hopefully, can everyone see my, did I share my screen now? Is that working, coming through all right? Yep.
Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
Awesome. So a little bit about me before I kick into all the slides and things. So myself, I'm an accredited Kanban consultant and accredited Kanban trainer. I've been doing sort of contracting consulting here in Melbourne for the last 10 years. I've kind of been in IT for about 20 now. But, you know, in those last 10 years, I've done a lot of mostly agile coaching or sort of delivery lead type work. And I first came across Kanban years and years ago. I think it was about 2010-ish. And I was on a course with Mary and Tom Poppendick were running a leading lean course. And they said, there's this new blue book, and where is it? I've got a copy here somewhere. No, don't have it. Yes, good. Yeah, there's this new blue book that's just come out by David Anderson. It's really, really good. It's all about Kanban. You should go check it out. It's very sort of lean focused and things like that. So I did, and I read that, and I thought this really resonated with me quite a lot, and started to do a lot more of my own learning and research sort of circa 2011, 12, 13. You know, and started using it a little bit through those years with some of the teams that I was helping. Come 2015, I actually got trained by David Anderson, who wrote the book on Kanban, and you know, and that's where I got that accredited Kanban consultant thing. And a couple of years after that, I became an accredited Kanban trainer, and I've been running training for the last, I think, nearly 2 years now. Yeah, probably nearly 2 years. Yeah, so it was mostly based in Melbourne, but good old coronavirus has forced us to be a little bit more flexible. So it's now all virtualized. So I'm sort of now getting around a lot more, and I can do a lot more things now like this, like the meetups and things like that, where I can talk to a lot more people, which has been really cool. So I'm been continuing to use a lot of Kanban over the last several years, but I mean, I've also got a lot of knowledge of the other agile practices like XP and Scrum and all the usual suspects. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. We've got a small group today, so I'm pretty happy to have a fairly open conversation. It doesn't need to be sort of terribly lecture style, so it can be a little bit Socratic if you like, and a bit of a discussion. Yes, because I've got a few slides here and I could probably talk all day, but it'd be good as well if you sort of give me some feedback as we're going through, or ask some questions, so that you know, I can tailor what I'm saying to sort of more of, you know, answer some of your questions and make sure I get what you wanted to hear about.
Would you prefer us just to pipe up, or perhaps maybe use put the hand up function, or yeah, I think or electric?
It's a small group, so just jump off mute and you know, throw a question out. But if we get a little bit bogged down or something like that, I'll have to move on, because we've got, when are we here till, Jace? Is it sort of another hour and a half-ish?
So yeah, another hour will be okay. Hour and a half, if you're happy to.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay.
Can I ask a question? And it may be Daniel, it's going to set what you're going to present, but which is fine. I've been coaching Agile for 3 years, mainly with DXC, although I left them in about May of this year. But I've been coaching Agile I've done it in face-to-face classes, and I've done it online. That includes Kanban and other things, right? And I've always used Kanban in a very simplistic way because it helps the audience understand in a very simplistic way how they can, you know, have all their items on the left-hand side and then prioritize them and shift them left to right across a board, which will have their customized columns in it. But in reading it, I gather there's a little bit more to Kanban than just that. Is that what you intend to kind of trot out today?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing, is that if people have just got stickies on a wall, you know, that sort of thing, they're really at the, you know, very, very, you know, shallow depths of Kanban. It's really, you know, probably not even Kanban. It's just stickies on a wall, you know. So I quite often encourage people to go a lot deeper, and because that's where you get the real benefits when you start looking at all the other Kanban practices that I'm going to talk about here today.
Oh, I look forward to it.
Yeah. So yeah, so I do notice that a lot, is that a lot of there is probably, to be honest, I think about anywhere between 60 and 80% of even the Agile coaches that I speak to, you know, they just give themselves titles Agile coaches, but they don't actually understand Kanban. And that's something that this is one of the reasons why I'm doing things like this, is because I want to make sure that people actually understand what it is. And if they don't, then they can, you know, reach out to people like myself and learn more about it, and hopefully become more effective at being Agile coaches with having a few more sort of quivers in your bow. Yeah, or arrows in your quiver. All right. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about scaling agility across your enterprise with Kanban. So this is a scaling group. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about in here are probably some of the more advanced topics. I won't go too deep because I'm guessing that a lot of you are probably at beginner to intermediate level of Kanban knowledge. You know, but if you are at sort of the more expert level, I'd be happy to have deeper conversations offline. But yeah. All right, so scale. So quite often when I ask people about scale, you know, I ask them, what do you mean when you're talking about scale? Do you just mean more? Do you mean larger? Is it getting extra complexity? So what do we mean when we're talking about scale? Because different organizations and different people, it will mean different things. You know, some people just think, you know, okay, we just need more stuff. That's probably a problem in and of itself, because more stuff is not necessarily the answer. You know, you need to also be more effective and things like that. But quite often there are large organizations that are, I guess, coming to the Agile table a little bit late, and sort of late majority or laggards. And they realize that they've got these stonking great big organizations that, you know, are not typically very agile just because of the nature, because they're big. You know, you can't turn an oil tanker on a dime. So, you know, that's kind of the nature of, you know, big organizations. But they want to be able to have a greater ability perhaps to answer to their market and things like that. So it usually often means maybe, you know, the organization you're in is larger, but I think it often comes with an extra level of complexity there, where you know, people have to deal with not just a team level thing. You're dealing with teams of teams, and you know, you could be looking at scales of hundreds, if not thousands, of people, you know, that you're trying to organize, align, and you know, trying to get a outcome through. So I think that's where a lot of organizations come unstuck. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to necessarily grow to become more effective either. You know, because oftentimes by scaling up, you might throw a lot more bodies at the problem, and that might not necessarily solve the problem. So just be careful that you're, you know, what you're talking about when you're talking about scale, and don't just assume larger is better, because quite often it's not. And I also ask people, you know, when you're looking to scale agility, what do you actually mean? What do people think about and mean when they hear agility? And usually, you know, a lot of the responses are faster, cheaper, you know, more staff. And that's probably the wrong answer. I think, you know, those larger, medium to larger organizations, they probably want to start to behave less like an oil tanker and more like a, you know, smaller vessel. So they see things that are coming in the market. I mean, COVID's a classic example where, you know, the things are going to, you know, come out of left field. It's going to be stuff that you don't predict. New competitors could come into the market. Demand can change, you know, and I think, to me, I think that's the key is at scale, how do you respond to change at that scale? You know, that key agile value, responding to change. I think that's probably one of the key things. And I've seen where organizations at scale have done this reasonably well, to the extent where, you know, a fairly large organization with a couple of thousand people in it decided we're going to change strategic direction. We're going to stop doing this kind of stuff and start with this kind of stuff. And I was actually quite impressed with the way the organization responded to that change in strategic direction, where, you know, within a few weeks, teams are already starting to reprioritize work, replan, and start to shift and adapt across the enterprise to deal with that. So that was a really positive instance where I saw a fairly large organization responding to a change, and that was strategically led, but it was also, there was a lot of customer feedback that led them to that decision. So, you know, responding to what the customers were demanding. And I think that's still really, really key is, you know, in terms of measuring your agility, you know, responding to real change, to changes in market, not just changes on a whim because someone's changed their mind of, you know, some sort of particular thing, but, you know, real things that the market shifted. We want to readjust the way we're answering the market and our customers and things like that. I think, you know, when you're dealing with scale, you've got to look at the organizational network and look at how you optimize through that network. And I put there as well, reinventing the organization. So that's not necessarily restructuring. When I say reinventing the organization, I'm thinking more about, you know, there are organizations out there that continually reinvent themselves and what their focus is. And I think one of the better examples of this is IBM. Now, IBM stands for International Business Machines. They're now a services company. Yeah. So this is an organization that, you know, took, you know, what was their core identity and actually started to shift what their core identity and focus is on. And there's a large cultural, you know, customer focused change that's going on there. And yeah, and when so just to reinforce that, I don't mean reorganize teams and all of that stuff. It's really looking at what is the purpose of the organization. And it kind of relates to that first point around responding to change. You know, how is the organization going to respond to a change that's in the market? You know, maybe a reinvention is a really deep, long-term survival change that you need to sort of undergo. And that's kind of, you know, a larger sense of agility, a larger strategic sense, rather than just being tactical. Is there any questions at this point? All right, I'll keep rabbiting on, but if you guys have any questions, just jump in and shout out at me. So that was just a little bit about scaling. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Kanban fundamentals, and then I'll hopefully start to bring these together afterwards, because I wanted to cover these off first, so we've at least got a common foundational understanding of what Kanban is, and because I find quite often a lot of people don't understand it terribly well. So Kanban's actually a management method. We use it to improve service delivery. Okay. It's not a framework like Scrum or SAFe. Okay. It's a management method. Okay. We use it to catalyze improvements. And, you know, when you're using Kanban and you should continually be looking for lots of new improvements, and that leads to the evolutionary nature of Kanban, and to evolve to be more fit for your customer's purpose or purposes. You know, you might have different customers with different needs, and you know, you do evolve to become, you know, and respond to that market and those needs. There was a good definition of done by what's his name? Yeah. Mike Burrows defines definition of done as someone's need was met. So he's quite a, you know, prominent member of the Kanban community. So I like to use that about thinking about what the purposes were. But back before COVID, I used to get people to write down different purposes on feedback sheets. And interestingly, for my training sessions, I'd find that there'd be, you know, you might get a training group of a dozen people, but you'd get, you know, 10 or 20 different reasons for why people actually came to the training session. So, you know, actually understanding what your customers want and, you know, why they're here, why they're paying their hard-earned cash for your service is really important, or product. But this is what Kanban's all about. So you can kind of start to see some linkage with the previous slide there around the evolving and, you know, the changing needs and responding to change. So I think, you know, there's really a lot of responding to change built into Kanban as you go deeper into it. Okay. All right. Kanban's all about evolutionary change, and this is these are the evolutionary change principles that are part of Kanban, and I think this is what sets it apart with a lot of other frameworks and other agile methods, and I'll compare a few in a little while. But they start with what you do now, and you actually try and at least initially respect the existing roles and processes that are in the organisation. Contrastingly, if you were to start Scrum with the team, one of the first things you need to do is introduce the concept of a Scrum Master and a product owner, because they probably don't have that. That can be quite challenging, particularly for groups that have never done Scrum before. And I've done a blog post on some of the product owner sort of anti-patterns that I've seen. Actually getting a good product owner and someone that can do that effectively is really quite difficult. So by putting in those higher, I guess, areas of resistance to change, other areas like Scrum and SAFe is another one, where I think with SAFe, they get you to start with doing a bunch of training, and then they realign value streams or release trains and things like that, reorganize people, indoctrinate them with training, and then away they go. I think I'm not a SAFe expert, but I think they call it a SAFe quick start or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
But that actually involves a lot of change before you even start. So conversely, Kanban's different, is it doesn't start with change, it starts with understanding where you are right now. And quite often people and groups don't understand where they are right now. I remember I started talking about this with a client of mine about 8 or 9 years ago, and there was a manager based here in Melbourne. He had, I think, one team member here in Melbourne, and most of the team were in, I think that group were in Bangalore, in India. And I said, okay, tell me about your process. How does it work? You've got these different kinds of work that are coming through. He goes, okay, we take this and it goes from A to B to C. And then we go off and we do something else. And then it eventually goes out and we hit production. And then, you know, some brave soul on the other end of the phone line said, that's not how it works. You know, and the manager was like, what? Tell me, how does it actually work? And you know, so that was a classic example that I learned early on, in that people don't actually understand how the work works currently. And getting a good understanding of that is really important, because that'll actually probably tell you where a bunch of your problems really are. You might not need to reorganize, just fix the problems that you're not aware of, you know, make them apparent. The next part about this is gain agreement to pursue evolutionary change and improvement. So, you know, there's often a few conversations that might be necessary to start the ball rolling. In some cases it might not. You might have enough control over a particular team that you use, that you manage or deliver with, and that you can start right now with not a lot of permission or none at all. You can just get started sometimes. The third part's really important, to encourage active leadership at all levels. So, you know, making sure that you've got good visibility, understanding, you know, that people have responsibility to each other and, you know, to the overall process, and they can and they're expected to display acts of leadership, whether they're technical people, BAs, product owners, whoever. You know, they should all have a role of leadership to the work that they're doing. Because, you know, a lot of this applies to, you know, you're working in a bunch of professional services. So, you know, you sort of treat everyone like professionals, and they need to be able to display that leadership as part of that. So encouraging that throughout the organization is really important. It's not necessarily just at the senior management level. It's all the middle management's usually you know, what they call the frozen middle. So there's a lot through the middle management and lower, even in the teams, that we can do to help move these larger organizations along.
Dan, I just thought I'd break the seal and ask a question.
Yeah.
So gaining agreement to, like, if I look at some of these things, acts of leadership, gaining agreement, etc. Are these positioned as activities or principles?
More about change management principles, these ones, yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, behind these, there'll be a bunch of activities that you may need to do, and it might not necessarily be just a once-off. So that leadership at all levels is you know, because that's part of the change principles, is that you need those acts of leadership to make change happen. And it's not something you do once and then that's it for the year. You know, it's something that you've got to constantly do.
Mm-hmm. Get the street credibility by being consistent. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So actually, to me, some of these change principles is one of the things that really drew me to Kanban. Is that it's quite different to a lot of other things where it's like, you know, you've got to have all of these things in place for it to work. Even XP. I remember in the early days when Ken Beck was doing XP, he says, look, you can sort of do these things on their own, like, you know, the continuous integration, the pair programming, the test-driven development, but it really works when you have them all together. So you can imagine for a new engineer that comes into a team that doesn't have any of these capabilities, the learning curve is very steep. So what we're trying to encourage with Kanban is not such a steep learning curve, is just a low bar to resistance, so you can get started. All right, here are the 6 basic practices from Kanban. So these are probably, you know, the first one is probably the one that you're most familiar with. And interestingly, one of the first case studies of Kanban that comes from Microsoft didn't do this first practice. So they did a bunch of other things to get going, but they didn't do the visualize. But quite a lot of people mentally associate visualize with Kanban, which is understandable. I mean, you know, it's come from sort of signal card systems and things like that. But I think in our sort of services industries, the visualize is really important, because a lot of what we do is invisible. It's in electronic documents. It's, you know, ones and zeros in computers. We can't physically see it, you know. So I use the example of once I walked around a factory, and I could see all of the things that were on the factory floor. It's a physical world, and you're dealing with physical things in manufacturing. In what I call knowledge work, you're dealing with intangible things. So the visualize is really important because you can't manage what you can't see. And all of this, work can otherwise be hidden. So the visualization can become really important. And just doing, quite often, with some of the teams I've worked with, just doing that one simple thing has shown them where a whole bunch of problems are, Limiting WIP. So WIP stands for work in progress or work in process. Okay. We limit WIP. We do that because there's a bunch of maths and queuing theory and other things behind it, but basically you can go a lot faster when you limit WIP. You can reduce a lot of strain on your staff when you reduce the WIP. You generally get a lot more done. It seems counterintuitive. You get more done by reducing your WIP. Yeah, so in my training sessions, I go through that in more detail with simulations so you can understand it. But we limit WIP. One of the things I quite often say to people is, it reasonable for you to work on 1,000 things concurrently? To which inevitably, I haven't heard anyone answer yes to that question to date. But so usually the discussion that follows is, okay, so you agree that we should limit WIP. I think the main thing that we don't commonly understand at this point is, where is that level? What should that level really be? And, in Kanban, we try and do that based upon, a variety of factors. I won't go into it all now because I want to get into more of the scaling parts. But I think if you're not limiting WIP, then you're probably not doing a Kanban system, because you haven't started to encourage all of those things that constraint starts to encourage, like collaboration, flow, and all of that other things. So the third practice there around managing flow only becomes really apparent with, particularly with those first two, is that, when you can see the work and you can limit the work in progress, you can start to manage the flow a lot better. So that's making sure that you're dealing with bottlenecks and issues, that you can see things in the flow where they are, and you can sort of look at, are things taking too long? Are they blocked? Are they stuck? But it's also around making sure you've got the right balance of risks in the overall flow as well, to help things flow more effectively. Again, it's probably not something I'm going to harp on too much in this, because I want to get to more of the scaling things. The explicit policies. So usually it's a matter of, if anyone's seen a Kanban board, it's like a tiny little checklist of a couple of items that says, okay, if I'm finished the analysis, I must have acceptance criteria or something on a story, or something like that would be a sort of explicit policy. I went to my local fish shop here today, and there was a explicit policy on the window that said no more than 3 people in the shop at once, because we've got all these COVID lockdowns going on. So I'm seeing a lot more explicit policies to do with Kanban out there in the world at the moment. You can see it in the supermarket. I mean, in our supermarket, there's little spots on the floor where you've got to stand 1.5 meters apart. So they're like explicit policies that tell you how things should operate in the system. So there's more and more of that happening in a COVID world.
In other ways of working, would you liken that to, say, definition of ready and definition of done, or acceptance criteria or something like that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, pretty much the same sort of thing. Yeah, it's there to make sure that everyone knows how the system works.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that we're sort of doing these things. And usually with a visual board, you do a little head check as well. So if you're moving something across, you go, oh, I've forgotten to do this. I better just double check that off before we move it across.
Mm-hmm.
Feedback loops. So with Kanban, there's 3 main feedback loops. One is the board. The second is the data. So we get into a whole heap of data and metrics in Kanban that are really important. And the third is, there's a whole series of cadences that come with Kanban as well. It's not just your daily sort of stand-up Kanban meeting. There's a bunch of others that we get into at greater levels of maturity, like flow reviews and operations reviews and risk reviews and things like that. we get into more detail of that at greater maturity levels. And then, of course, improve and evolve. So it's a continual evolution. So you're going to be making changes, and it's about monitoring and making sure that they're either working and you roll them forward and keep them going, or they're not, then you roll it back and try something else. So it's a continual evolution. And we use things like the data to help us, understand whether or not we've made an improvement. So those are the 6 Kanban practices. Who here has not seen those before? All 6? Has anyone not seen those before? No?
Not all the 6, but most of them. I'm not sure like how we define manage flow in kind of thing. Like I'm not clearly like manage flow in terms of like it's like a general concept. Everybody does it kind of thing. So no one mentions it like a managing flow kind of thing. So other than that, most of them, yes.
Yeah, and there's, when you get into the detail, there's a little bit more to it under the bonnet. So again, this is another thing about Kanban, is all of these sort of aspects are not deeply understood, particularly if you haven't been through this with an experienced Kanban practitioner or through some training or something else before. These are not immediately apparent, but that's a really important practice. All right, I'm going to go through now. Okay,
we just got a question in the chat as well, if you don't mind, Dan.
Yeah, so go for it.
It's Amit's asked a question, which is, do we have daily stand-ups in Kanban? I believe it's not needed, as visualization is a pretty powerful tool here.
No, we do that. We have what we call the daily Kanban meeting. It's basically the same sort of thing, but the way we go about it is different. So instead of, I think a lot of Scrum teams used, what were you doing yesterday? What are you going to do today? What are your blockers and impediments? Those sorts of things. We generally, in Kanban, the way we construct the boards is all of that's actually on the board. We don't need everyone to tell us what's going on with that. But what we do is we walk the board from right to left and see, okay, what's blocked, who needs help, who's free for new work, those kinds of things. So it's a slightly different conversation. So again, to the managing flow, you set up your daily Kanban meeting so that you're focusing on flow and managing that flow. And we walk the board from right to left because we focus on finishing, not focusing on starting. Yeah, so we want to start with the things that are close to done and then move our way to the left. Okay, so hopefully that's answered the question.
Yeah, that does answer the question. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks, Amit. Okay, so Kanban's different to a lot of other techniques. So I mentioned SAFe before, where you do kickoffs with release trains or value streams or whatever it is. It takes a lot of people. As I said, it can be disruptive. Other things that I've seen in the market before are things like, we're going to go reorganize into the Spotify model. And I think that's absolutely nuts, because not even Spotify use the Spotify model. And I also think it's nuts because, okay, for the next 6, maybe 12 months, your organization's going to be doing a whole bunch of navel gazing, trying to figure out how on earth each of the individuals fit into this whole new scheme, how they're going to deal with their new roles and responsibilities. And meanwhile, your competitors are going off and they're actually making improvements and getting ahead and looking at the market. So I think, in some ways, I've seen small and medium orgs do this kind of thing, and they inevitably hit a whole bunch of inertia, and they come out of it the other end. Sometime it might take a couple of years, and then they realize, oh shit, we've still got a bunch of the same problems. It actually hasn't necessarily solved their key problems. So in Kanban, we really discourage doing that off the bat. I think it's a really expensive, risky way about going about change. So, it also generally makes people quite uncomfortable, and it threatens their roles and their identities. So what if, you started a big Scrum transition and your organization said, right, project managers, we don't need you anymore because we're going to use Scrum Masters. Yeah. How do you think the project managers would feel about that? How do you think they're going to adapt to Scrum Mastery, if at all? You know, how disruptive is that going to be? What are they going to do in order to save their own hides, you know, in terms of save their jobs, save their roles, and, you know, those kinds of things. So all sorts of weird things play out when you do those kinds of changes. So it's generally large and disruptive. And if you're going to do it in your organization, I think your competitors are going to love you for it. So, you know, if you're going to give that a try, then, you know, go ahead, because I'm sure someone else will hopefully try something different. And what I don't like about things like, I'll bash SAFe for a little bit, so my apologies to the SAFe lovers, is that you know, we shouldn't follow a one-size-fits-all kind of scenario. You know, every organisation is going to be different. Organisations have different history, they have different cultures, different identities, and different sizes, different customers, different markets, those kinds of things. You know, in that way, every organisation is fairly unique. I'm not saying that there aren't patterns that can be applied to that. But what I'm saying is, you know, a lot of people put the blinders on and just blindly follow the pattern. I think, you know, you've got to be more like that example that I said before, is look at your context. Remember that manager that had someone on the other end of the phone that spoke out. Actually understand the context before you act. Yeah, understand how things really work right now, and understand the problems that are unique to you, to the business, and how they, you know, or it could be a government organisation, which is slightly different again, or not for profit. So don't follow a one size fits all, because it probably won't work terribly well. And that being said as well, I think SAFe is a very technology centric thing. Where I've seen SAFe implementations come a little bit unstuck is, you know, it feels a bit like the tail wagging the dog. So the IT side of the business is trying to change. But when I go in with Kanban, I not only want to talk to IT, you know, you can use Kanban to apply to marketing teams, to HR teams, to product teams, to what else have I applied it to? You can apply it to sales even. You know, so because it's based upon services and we're not trying to introduce new roles or be terribly disruptive, and it's a management method, you know, you can manage any of those services that you've got, like your legal department, you know, they provide legal services to your organization. Yeah, you can start to apply Kanban in that sort of domain, and come up with solutions that are specific to that sort of domain. So I'd be very reluctant to follow a one size fits all, because you know, even in your IT teams, your teams are going to be different as well. So your data teams are going to be different to your software teams, that are going to be different to, like, your COTS teams or something else like that. You know, so all of those, the nature of those, that type of knowledge work can be quite different. I'm seeing a few smiles. Is that sort of resonating with a few people? Have you sort of experienced this kind of thing before?
Feel free to come off mute, but yeah, the one size fits all thing is incredibly important. And I mean, regardless of whether you're implementing Scrum at a team level, or you're trying to scale Agile with whatever framework you might be using, you still need to recognize that a framework is just a set of tools, and recognize the problems that you're trying to solve. You don't necessarily always have to implement the entire ecosystem of a framework to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Daniel, I might just jump in here. I've got a business owner that believes in Kanbans and he loves them. But the problem I've got, he's got 21 columns and we're following a piece of work through 21 columns, right? that varies from four parts of the business. And I've tried to get him to say, listen, one size does not fit all. We want to break this up into different Kanbans for different groups because we don't need to follow that piece of work. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll actually come to that in a minute, George. I've got a slide that I'm going to start to talk to that to a little bit. So yeah, but do remind me if I don't pick up on it in enough detail. Yeah. Was there another question or comment from the group?
I just want to say.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Does it have any routine manufacturing? And if so, can you talk about it?
Yeah, so there are definitely links to manufacturing. So a lot of the original Kanban ideas came from Japan and companies like Toyota, where they had the old signal cards and things like that, and that's where they'd send the cards around the manufacturing shop floor to say, okay, we've got 3 bins of bolts here that we're using to manufacture with the cars. We're starting to run out of this one. Send the card down to get another bin full of bolts so that we can keep going. So there is definitely linkages with manufacturing, but again, it's not a one size fits all. So knowledge work domain, as I mentioned earlier, is quite different to manufacturing. So the same principles don't necessarily apply in the same ways because the nature of the work and the context are slightly different.
Thank you.
No worries. Was there another question or comment?
No, I just
I
wanted.
think, yeah, sorry. I think, as you said, like the philosophy of Kanban, it says like flow like water. So, that actually means it's very adaptable, customizable. So it suits probably every industry, not just the idea or manufacturing.
Yeah. Sorry, was there, who was it there?
Yeah, it was me. I was just about to say that I have seen most of the projects they deliver successfully because it doesn't follow one method. There is it picks up the rituals that works for that particular team. For example, on a daily stand-up, we were using Kanban team, and we used to speak through it and move our tickets move our cards accordingly on the board. And that was the Kanban aspect of it. But some of the ceremonies we have picked up from Agile, and some of the ways of process of doing things were picked up on SAFe when it was, there were multiple development teams. So I feel like it's always a combination of methodologies and frameworks that needs to be picked up for success, I think.
Yeah, and that's right. Like I quite often, with a lot of my software teams, I quite often instill XP practices, like tech practices, to back up some of the other aspects here, so that because it's a technology thing, so they've got to be good at doing that as well. So yeah, and Kanban applies over the top of your existing process, so it's not a replacement, it's an additive to it, and it starts to evolve with whatever you start from where you are now. Yeah. Okay, so understanding a little bit about why Kanban's different. I think this is something that I talk about in my training courses a bit, where I give people a slightly different Kanban lens, and I teach people how to see your organization as a network of services. So you've got a variety of technology teams. They're all providing different services. You've got, marketing, sales, HR, legal, all of these groups that are providing services. And quite often, one of the biggest problems is that those groups are all disconnected. Now, particularly in large organizations, and this is where I also think that reorganizing things is a bit futile when you get into large organizations, because you're always going to have silos. Like if your organization is 1,000 odd people or more, you're not going to know everyone in that organization. You're not going to know how all the different types of work are flowing through the system in enough detail. It's too much detail and things for you to keep a track of. So you will necessarily start to get some silos, and generally this is based upon those service groups. But I think what's key is to know where the key interaction points are in that network, who's interacting with whom on a regular basis, and try and enhance that visibility, those relationships, and those things, and start to optimize the overall network of things in your organization. And this little diagram I quite like, because this might represent different teams or departments in your organization and how they connect with each other. I've done this with certain tools where I've dumped out interdependencies and come up with different visualizations to help show people how the organization interacts with itself. And it can be quite good to start to see improvements that you were probably not aware of before, or interactions and dependencies that you're not aware of. In the big organizations, you won't get zero dependencies. You'll always have interdependencies. It's about, I guess, minimizing the number of touch points wherever you can, and managing the rest, because you won't eliminate dependencies altogether.
Do you have a favorite tool for that, mapping? Do you have a favorite tool for mapping that out?
Not really. It depends. I used something a couple of years back, but there's a chap by the name of Brad Quirk. For those of you lucky enough to use Jira, he was originally on one of my I was trained with him to become an AKT, but he's gone off and done other things, and he's created a plugin to help visualize interdependencies between work in Jira. And yeah, I just saw him put a LinkedIn post up probably in the last couple of weeks where he's made some enhancements and dropped a tool plugin. Brad Quirk is his name.
Yeah.
And so he's done, he's a Melbourne-based chap, and yeah, so he's done a bunch of stuff, and he's big on data visualizations and all of that sort of stuff. So, but there's a bunch of other tools out there that can help you with this as well. And I think some of the more mature Kanban tools can show you this a little bit better than other tools like Jira, where it can show you interdependencies and linkages. But yeah. But I use more data and graphic visualization tools. I can't remember the name of the one that I used offhand.
I guess if you get stuck, you could use a corkboard, some pins, and some string. Yeah.
And there are other things like Sankey diagrams is one. I'm not sure if you've heard of the term Sankey diagram. So they can be useful for showing all of the interdependencies and things within groups and where the work's flowing from and to. Yeah. So actually seeing those things is really, really useful. And, just starting to, I'll get to I think it's the next slide. Okay, no, a couple of slides down.
Daniel, if I can ask you a question from the previous, the slide.
This one?
No, the next one. So,
this one?
Yeah, this one, yeah. What exactly those blue dots do you consider them as? This one as the crucial ones, or?
So they might be the crucial ones, or it might be, because organizations that get larger and more complicated generally don't have a single customer group, or they're dealing with multiple products, different product lines or services, different, customer groups. So the requests might be quite different. So the way one request will flow through the network might be different to the way another request type would flow through the network. Does that make sense? So yeah, you're going to have all of these different pathways through that network that'll light up based upon the type of or nature of the request.
Yep, I was also thinking in terms of like those where the blue dots, whenever a thread goes out of the blue color, it should not be, all of them should not be white. There should be a red color or a blue color itself, so that there is some effective in that process. If that comes out of that might be the office of CEO. If they send out a communication or something like that, even the flow must have some turnaround or importance kind of thing.
Well, and that's another thing is if your organizational diagram, because quite often there's hierarchical parts to the organization, but don't follow the reporting lines. I'd say when you're mapping this kind of thing out, map out the work and the groups within that are interacting. Don't map out the you know, the reporting lines, because they won't tell you much. They'll tell you, you know, that reporting line basis. It won't tell you how the work's working in the organization. And that's kind of what you really want to focus on, is how those customer requests are flowing through the system.
Yes, yeah, the workflow, yes, exactly. To get the job done, whom to speak, yeah.
Yeah, so follow the work. And in a number of organizations, I've found that there are often some teams or service groups that become the bottleneck because they're in high demand, you know, and that demand may vary. You know, so certain groups might have high demand at certain times of year. Like I've noticed that architecture groups in technology generally have a high demand at the start of the new financial year, because what happens is a lot of new projects start up and everyone goes, oh shit, we got a new project, we need architects to help design this stuff. And so for the first 3 months you can't buy an architect for love or money, you know, because, you know, everyone's doing it because they haven't really managed their flow through the organization. It's just this large batch going through. You know, so there'll be sort of seasonal demand for certain services as well. So understanding the nature of the demand and the frequency and all of that sort of thing that we talk about and is really important. But I'm going to keep going on because otherwise I'll be here all night. But again, address the key pain points that are going on in the organization. They might be sort of customer or requester pain points, or there might be pain points within the team, because quite often if you talk to the team that are servicing these requests, they might describe something that actually might be creating a customer problem down the line. But what we usually do with Kanban is we use static, is what we call the systems thinking approach to introducing Kanban. So that's static with a K. And we use static. So this is like Kanban first principles. So whenever you go into a team or a service group, you apply static to start to understand it and you know, sort of model how things are working and figure out what you need to do to start to make improvements. So here's an overview of static. To be honest, this incorporates probably about 2-3 other talks that I've done. So I'm glossing over these things really quickly because I want to get to some of the more fun stuff about scaling. So start with understanding what's fit for purpose, the sources of dissatisfaction or problems from a customer and a team perspective, analyze the nature of the demand, the delivery capability, model the workflow. We're just talking about these things. Identify and define classes of service. So things like, you know, is it just standard? Is there a fixed date for like a regulatory requirement or something like that that's coming, you know, in 6 weeks, or is there an expedite or something like that because the website's down? Classes of service. Then you actually intentionally design the Kanban system. I think most of you are probably in the technology industry. What really strikes me as bizarre is that people will spend days, weeks, hours, months designing technological systems, but they spend practically no time at all thinking about and actively designing their system of work. Think of your system of work as another system, and you'll get a lot of bang for your buck if you redesign that. You know, that'll do a lot of the heavy lifting for you and save you a lot of time and effort if you think about and intentionally design your system of work. It's not.
Are you really getting at business processes there? Right? So sort out your business processes first, and then apply your IT systems to deliver those business processes.
Yes and no is the short answer to that.
That's a good one.
Because, you know, the Kanban system might apply to the way the data analytics team work. So they might service requests throughout the organization. You know, so you might design a Kanban system for that particular service or group. And you generally don't start at the top level necessarily. You quite often start at the lower levels. Not saying that you can't start at the top level, but quite often you start with a few things and start to expand out. So generally with Kanban, when you're applying static, it's not okay, everyone go and do static on your thing, and then in 2 weeks' time, we're all going to be doing Kanban and away you go. it's not about that. It's, you know, you start with a couple of teams, design them, move on the next couple, the next couple, the next couple, and continue to evolve things throughout the organization. The last one, socialize the design and negotiate implementation. So
in the identify and define the classes of service, you're referring to classes of service as the type of work?
No, so that's work item type. So generally the work item type is in the nature of the demand. So that's that. The classes of service are more like a policy around how we deal with the different priorities. So we might have different WIP limits per class of service. You know, we might have, you know, and you know, different ways of dealing with it. So, you know, if the Amazon website is down, we're going to drop whatever the hell we're working on right now and just get the website back up because we're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars a second. Yeah. So it's more around, you know, loosely as priority, but classes of service is the Kanban term for it. Okay, so in Kanban, we'll look at the ways we scale agility. So we scale through height, width, or depth, or, you know, or a mixture of these. So what we'll do is we'll look at each one in detail. So we'll look at height. So different levels in the flow. So are you down in the weeds at the team level? Whereas yesterday I was talking to a team that do a lot of regulatory improvements, and I said, okay, you're tracking tasks at the team level, but are you actually tracking how that whole regulatory requirement or need from that government body passes from that government body through our whole system of work and gets out, and then we say, yep, we've complied, you know? So, you know, not just the task level down in the weeds, but looking at, you know, where that sort of request is really flowing at that higher level, because it might cross and need multiple teams to work on it throughout its life cycle. There might be something at a larger portfolio level, like, you know, I've talked to a lot of companies where, you know, you might get a 100-person company and they're working on 120 projects concurrently, you know, stupid stuff like that. So it might be a case of, okay, we'll apply Kanban at that portfolio level. We'll, instead of doing 120 concurrent projects that will never get done, we'll focus on 20 or 30, which is almost like a WIP limit at the project level. Another good way of thinking about a WIP limit is focus. So if you don't have that, you probably don't have a hell of a lot of focus, and you won't get much done at all. You'll be context switching the whole time. So height is one dimension that we go to, and we can apply Kanban at those different levels in the organization. Okay. So I think that example with the projects, you know, you can sometimes get some really great benefits applying sort of some of those practices at the high level. Scaling for width. So sometimes I start with teams and then their focus is just from here to here and it's quite narrow. So we call that sort of like the system lead time, but the actual end customer is further downstream. So you know, we might start to include more things like, you know, the definition of done might expand to not just the stories being tested and it's being tested in our SID environment to it's been deployed to UAT. Our, you know, key customers or stakeholders have UAT'd it, and then we've gone and deployed it to production. So moving that definition of done further to the right, you know, and encompassing, you know, further to, okay, it's now in our customers' hands. And then also going upstream, because quite often, you know, when you get a request, it's gone through several layers of stuff before it gets to a team. And then they say, oh, lo and behold, you've got a couple of weeks to implement this because it took 3 months to get here, yeah? So it might be worthwhile looking what's upstream and looking at that process and starting to Kanbanize that. So that, you know, the overall flow from what Mary Poppendick calls concept to cash is really covered.
Full value stream.
Or value stream, yeah, exactly.
Mm.
So yeah, and I think that's my comment there. Looking up and down the value stream, and looking and extending outwards. So going sort of wider. So that's width. So you can always, you know, do that with your teams and services and groups. Is to look up and downstream, because quite often I found, particularly, there's a good book. If you haven't seen this yet, this is Klaus Leopold, and he's got this book, Rethinking Agile, Why Agile Teams Have Nothing to Do with Agility. And you'll see he's constructed this massive board that sort of snakes its way around. And this is the team area here. And he goes, yeah, we're so, effing agile, because they're dealing with this. But, meanwhile, there's all of this other stuff that's snaking around. This is the kind of thing that I'm talking about with width. Check out this book. I've got a reference in the slides because it's a really easy read and it so makes sense.
So that's really good. I like that. That's really resonated with me.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's been groups before that have implemented pair programming and test-driven development, but that's not where their biggest bottleneck is. So if there's a 3-month wait state before it actually gets to the team, there's no point in improving, knocking 2 or 3 days off the lead time. Focus on the big rocks and move those. And you might need to go up and downstream to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The next is around looking for depth. So, you quite often get teams that are interdependent, like that network diagram that I showed. So, team A is working on something, but then they need team B to do something else. But team B also needs team C to do something else as well. And so you get these interdependent effects that are going on. So, look at the way this flow is occurring across that network and start to optimize so that you can, balance the flow across that. So this is probably one of the more advanced things that I talk about more in my Kanban systems improvement course. So this is harder to do. So get some of the basics there first. And then you can start to look at, going for depth, because that can be a little bit more complicated.
How do you go about, I guess, the synchronization of that? If I'm right in this statement, if you're not operating in a sprint fashion where you've got, short periods of time that you can sort of look to synchronize across, and team A is ready so that team B can consume it, etc.
Yeah.
Is it just due date driven type work, or?
In a way, we quite often use classes of service for that. And there's a new thing, I don't have a poster on the wall, but there's a new thing called triage tables that David Anderson released within the last couple of months that helps teams start to figure out when they need to start those bits of work. But we're getting into the more advanced stuff now, because it usually requires a base level of capability to sort of get to that point. Because otherwise you're rushing a lot of things. But yeah, so this is some of the more advanced things. We don't necessarily have synchronized cadences, but there are Kanban cadences, like each one of these sort of teams or boards would have a replenishment cadence that should be made explicit. Like, is it a weekly replenishment, a daily replenishment, monthly replenishment? And those sorts of things. So making sure that those things are quite explicit and known amongst the overall network is really important. And looking upstream and downstream to make sure you can sort of see interdependencies coming and what your downstream teams need as well. So it's also about taking off those blinkers and looking up and around in the organization.
Not just about your project.
Sorry?
It's not just about your project. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, actually, yeah, because projects are just large batches of work, and usually if you optimize for a particular project, you'll sub-optimize your whole organization. So this is quite often what we struggle with the dichotomy between projects and everything else in Agile.
Just to add on, sorry if I intervene. Jason, I'm not sure whether I'll be answering your question. I think that we had a methodology like push and pull. Like when you're done, when you've done with your piece and it has to move to the next teams, you're not going to tell them what exactly you need to do. We used to maintain a board, and I will move to the done in my team's done board, and the next team will take the card from there. So which one, there are a list of tasks which is done, what is relevant to them. So there is like, you're not pushing them. So it is like push and pull method. I'm not sure. We used to follow that one.
You're absolutely right. And that's where Kanban's distinguished from other systems of work, is that real Kanban systems are pull systems.
Yes. Push ones are like, they might create friction between the teams, and sometimes even the egos might clash as well. So it is better to be the pull one.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. Here's something else as well when you're looking at depth. This has been around for a little while, but version 2 of the book has just recently came out. I think it's available for pre-order or something now, or it's coming out in the next few weeks. So I've got myself on a pre-order list for it. But the Kanban maturity model is something for coaches and managers looking for deeper organizational maturity. So this will look at the different levels of maturity or capability of groups and teams. And you can look at where you are, what might be some of the next steps that you can start to do, and you know what problems those steps are supposed to be catering to. So it's kind of like a group of patterns that Kanban coaches have used around the world for the last 10 years or something, sort of distilled into a bit of a model. So it's not supposed to be a deep framework. It's supposed to be something for coaches and managers to look at and help them guide, okay, what's the next set of improvements that we might be able to do, and how do we help the teams get to the next level. Coincidentally, a lot of the teams that we deal with in the Kanban world are sort of the 0 to 1, maybe some 2s. Occasionally you get 3s and 4s. There's very few at the 5s and 6s. But generally it's sort of 2s and below. About 80% are sort of maturity level 2 and below. That's really it. So I've talked about a few things around the 3 different dimensions for how to scale agility with Kanban. I've talked about Kanban itself, its change principles. I've talked about static. There's been a lot that I've tried to cover off in a very sort of, it's relatively shallow fashion. So I hope that I've piqued some of your interest there, and that you might want to learn more, because underneath this maturity model, there is bucket loads of information about how Kanban can work and help you, and things you can do to adjust. So I find that's one of the things that keeps me coming back to Kanban, is that there's a lot of depth to it, and there's always lots more to learn from the community that's out there. So I really enjoy it for that reason. So I just wanted to I just wanted to throw to some of this stuff now, because I've got a bunch of blog posts. So if you go to the Kanban subpage, there's a bunch of Kanban stuff there as well. There's, what else? Where have I got it? I've got it. Yeah, here it is. This is the second book. There is this Essential Kanban Condensed. So you can, if you go to that URL there, you can get a free PDF copy of that, which is, it's not the same as, but it's kind of the equivalent of the Scrum Guide. So there's about 50 pages that tell you about the Scrum basics and what's involved, and it's just a very brief overview of what Kanban is. So I'd encourage you, if you want to get to know it a little bit, grab that free guide from that link there. The Kanban maturity model that I mentioned, there's a link there as well, and that other book, the Rethinking Agile one that I mentioned, there's a link there to that as well. So there are some books. All right, I've got some information about training first. Do we want to do questions and answers first, Jace, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Or depending on if there are questions or answers at this point in time, we can throw to the training stuff and then come back to Q&A if people as a final check. But does anyone have any burning questions right now? Something they've been holding on to and thinking, oh, I really wanted to ask that question on slide 3, but I didn't quite get there. I just as an observation, I guess, like one of the main missions of this this group is to look at different tools and processes and frameworks and that sort of thing that help you as an individual or your organisation to I guess demystify scaling agile, and quite often you can start to see some parallels between different frameworks, and you go, oh, that's included in here, and when you talked about this bit, I could see that in the LESS framework, or there are lots of similarities that do cut across. Do you have a preference on supporting frameworks? People often say that Scrum and Kanban sit quite nicely together, but do you have any other sort of frameworks that are your go-to to support?
Yeah, SAFe is around everywhere, and so it's quite prevalent in the market. So it's probably not so much I go there for support, but I go there because I need to understand what's going on in an organisation. So I've never done a day's SAFe training, but I've been in organisations that have done SAFe implementations, or have undergone that, and I've walked in partway through it or whatever it is. So having to know it is useful. I think I took, before it became known as LESS, I always liked some of the stuff from Bas Vode and Craig Larman that LESS was based on, because they had a big Scrum and Lean sort of focus on it. And I think that's more of the, I really like some of the things like the things that they had in their books around causal loop diagrams and all of those other sorts of things. And in one of my training sessions, I actually use a causal loop diagram to describe what's happening in a Kanban system and how those interactions work. So I think there are some overlaps there, but there's also overlaps with Kanban and SAFe as well, because SAFe are, like Dave Snowden calls them, the Borg, and they've assimilated pretty much everything. And so SAFe is Kanban's kind of in there, but it's still a little bit shallow in terms of what they've got in their implementation there. And there's so much else going on in SAFe that it doesn't always get a very deep look in. So
I think they're starting to look upstream a bit more, but perhaps less, not quite downstream enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why I think that the width, scaling width diagram resonated so well.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you can see a lot of pipeline management and things like that, considerations on how it gets into a development pattern.
Yeah.
But I guess going back to the LESS example, there's probably not as much downstream dealing with the undone department and that sort of thing. So yeah.
And there's also an example that I had thinking about that now that you mention it, Jason, where I was working for a client, and they were a small company, about 150 people, and they had technology or software and data products that they released to market, and creating a program level or a sort of company level board that showed the different chunks of work moving through the overall stream was good for other groups like marketing, HR, legal, and those groups, and sales as well, because they could actually see where they hook in. Because one of the other complaints were, marketing team would say, all of a sudden, the IT folks would just dump this thing on us, and now we've got to go and promote it with only a week or two's notice. We'd like, obviously you've been working on this for the last 3 months. And ironically, they were in the same building on the same floor, so they didn't actually traverse the floor to talk to each other. But when we actually put it on this, sort of company-wide board, they all said, oh, okay, we can see this is coming. We can start to prep the marketing for this new feature that's coming out. So it's other interactions, I think, that are deeper with other departments that, other agile methods don't go into, because they generally deal in just technology. I think Kanban can cross those organizational boundaries a lot cleaner.
Sure. And Lisa asked a question on chat as well, which is interested in your views in teams adopting Scrumban.
Yeah, sure. So usually what happens is it's a case of teams have started with Scrum, and as I said before, you apply Kanban over the top. So I actually, there's also another pack that I've done talks about Scrum and Kanban as well, where, you know, you apply both together. And, you know, there's a lot of teams that I've seen that have started with Scrum and hit a bunch of problems, and then we started to apply some different Kanban thinking over the top of it, and started to help them out quite a lot. And they quite often evolve to something that it diverges from Scrum quite often. And some of the Scrum purists freak out because they say, oh, but that's not Scrum. And I'm like, so Agile is the means, it's not the ends, you know, so you've got to adapt to what the need is and the problems that you're trying to solve. So that's quite often how I deal with that is again, like we talked about here, is focus on what are the key problems that you're trying to deal with. Yeah. Were there other questions?
My question is, can we implement it digitally?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. What I might do, Jace, I might send you some links that you can put onto the meetup group to other digital boards, because people quite often think about Jira as the default. So if you're stuck with Jira, you're probably stuck with a low maturity Kanban implementation, just because the implementation of Kanban in that tool is quite shallow. Okay. There are others.
Statuses.
Yeah, there are other things around like Swift Kanban, Kanbanize. There's a plugin called Get Nave or Nave that people use if they're stuck with Jira, so that you can get all the Kanban data points out, which is really quite neat. And there's also the other older ones like Lean Kit and things like that as well that are still kicking around. But generally, actually, I was speaking to the Lean Kit product development folks earlier this week. But generally, I think some of the newer ones have more newer features coming out more frequently than some of the older ones like Lean Kit. I'll send you some links to that, Jace, because I've got a few links that have things like extended trials, so you can get 3-month trials instead of the regular 1 month.
Oh, cool stuff.
Yeah.